Thinking about a political way to end the war, some people talk about cutting a political fig leaf, small enough for Ukraine and collective West to accept, but sufficient for Putin to deflect challenges at home. But considering the successful counteroffensive of Ukrainian army today, this idea seems to be foreclosed. So what dynamic you can think about for creating space for this cutting of political fig leaf for both sides?
Yeah, so the question is about creating the political space for both sides to be able to come to an agreement. And that is where we can think back about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the anniversary right now, 60 years. And it was a time when we had two leaders, Khrushchev and JFK, who recognized the world was on the brink of nuclear war. They had to talk to each other, and they had to come up with a compromise. And it's interesting how is portrayed or remembered in the US is that Russia backed down and took its missiles away from Cuba. What is not talked about is that it was a compromise, and that the US also removed its missiles from Turkey. And there was something that JFK said a year later that is so relevant today. He said, if you are in a fight with a nuclear power, never give them the option or back them into a corner where their only option is either a humiliating defeat or the use of a nuclear weapon. And that's exactly what we're doing today. So you are so right. Other people call it an off-ramp, compromise, whatever it is. And there are many things that have to be discussed and that could be compromises that could allow Putin to tell his population that they didn't lose everything in this war. And some of those things would be rights guaranteed for Russian speakers in Ukraine, independent, internationally observed elections in the Donbass and in Crimea, lifting of sanctions from the US part, negotiations around arms reduction treaties that the US had pulled out of and we need to go back into, neutrality for Ukraine being the number one. So there are many ways to form compromises that would be face-saving enough for Putin to feel like he didn't have to, being backed in a corner, use a nuclear weapon.
I think this is such an important point to underline. Western analysts seem so happy, cheering for a major domestic crisis in Russia. And I think people should think, and maybe you'll say a word about what it would look like if Russia imploded. Not only a major nuclear power, but a humiliated, angry population that then instead of being supported gets further humiliation. What does it look like if the kind of warmongers of the Democratic Party win this argument? It's a little terrifying.
And what happens if Putin is forced to resign? Is there somebody more extremist who comes in? Is there a civil war in Russia? What happens to all the nuclear weapons that are in Russia right now? It's very scary. And many of us don't like Putin. And we are scared about what is the end result that the US wants when it says weaken Russia. What does that mean exactly?
And so say a word again about what we here in this room and we who are listening to this, what should we do? What is to be done? What should citizens do?
So I think we have to use every tool in our toolkit. The most important one I think now is education, because we are up against a mass media that is really full of propaganda. And the message that's being sent is that victory for Ukraine is around the corner. Just send in more weapons and they will be able to win back every inch of land that the Russians have taken since 2014, which is delusional. So we have to educate people, and that's why we have the book, that's why we have this 20-minute video that we'd love if you could use, if you have access to showing it in any university classes, to your faith-based group, to your community organization, in libraries. That would be terrific, and get these kind of discussions going all over. We're also calling on people to go back to the old-fashioned house parties. Invite your friends over and use the video and talk about these issues. Education, 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 I'd say, is the first thing, because we need to increase our numbers first. And then I would say, at the same time, join things like Code Pink or Peace in Ukraine. The Peace in Ukraine Coalition is coming up with actions this week. They're about using social media together to focus on the nuclear weapons issues. We have days that we're focusing on contacting the corporate media and asking them and giving them a list of peacemakers or people with a different opinion that we'd like to hear. You might have heard Jeffrey Sachs, for example, fabulous on this issue, and somebody with incredible credentials, although some blame him for the privatization in Russia that was so devastating to the Russian people. He says he can't get an op-ed in a mainstream paper, and that when he was only got onto TV once on Bloomberg News, and when he was asked about who blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and he said the rational response, which is,
the U.S.
They were horrified and said, Jeffrey, how can you say that? And quickly he was off and hasn't been asked back on. So we can push the media to have other voices. And we have a list of people that we'd like to have on in the Peace in Ukraine website. We have flyers, we have educational materials you can use. And then there also is the issue of our representatives. That we have to do that as much as we don't like it, or as much as we're frustrated, or you've done it before and it doesn't change their minds. We've got to do it. And I think whether it's call-in days, whether it's asking for meetings in their offices, or whether it's doing protests outside of their offices, we've got to make our voices heard. And we're also encouraging people to come to Washington and join us and get meetings there in their offices with your senators, with your representative, and we'll help you have places to stay, get those meetings. So those are some of the things we have to do.
Yeah, it's worth remembering too, when people look back and romanticize the anti-Vietnam War movement, it took years to build, and we still didn't end the war. I mean, the war dragged on for 10 years. So, yeah, we can get frustrated and we can get burned out, but we have to kind of then rally, wake up the next morning and try again. I mean, what else is there?
And I think after the elections, we will find a lot more openings within the Democratic Party, because they'll feel a little bit freer to speak out. And so if they hear from us, especially after the elections, I think we can have an impact.